background music while we're waiting. Soothing music.
I forgot this is Zoom. Yes, I can put on backgrounds.
Okay, so I do make it 1 o'clock. So I think we will make a start there. So welcome everybody to this session. Oh, I don't know what I've done there. Okay, so my name is Dr. Jane Dennis. I am from Queen Mary University of London, and I'm chairing this session this afternoon. And we've got a couple of different talks this afternoon. What we'll do is we'll run one talk and then the second talk, and then we'll have a general Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, then feel free to post those in the chat and we'll pick them up as we go through. Well, we'll pick them up in the Q&A session at the end. Or you can just raise your hand and we can just have a chat once the presentations are finished. So our first speaker in this session is Jonathan Parker, and he's joining us from Keele University. And he's going to be talking to us about the challenges and obstacles faced by students completing their final year research projects. So over to you, Jonathan.
Right, thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Right, this was, if you've read the paper, this is going to be slightly different. This was meant to be a project in which we interviewed a range of students across disciplines to find out what problems they had, doing research projects generally and during the pandemic. But then COVID happened and the university decided to completely reorganize and made all the admin staff reapply for their jobs. So we never hired any researchers, so we never did any interviews. So what this is we had to shift, and this is a pilot study of the interviews along with some other approaches to looking at this question. So it looked a little bit different from the paper, but it's the same topic. Oops, sorry. I've done exactly the same thing. There we go. So just looking at the place of the dissertation or the research project in higher education, it is a hugely important part of the degree. If you look at the way in which it's promoted across disciplines, again, outside of business degrees, it is almost ubiquitous. So again, that final year project is a massive part of the student experience. Probably the most important piece of work they're going to do in their degree. Now, interestingly, if you look at, and this is from a previous work I've done on this, looking at one university, there are certain patterns that are very important for issues of equity. If you look at the attainment gap, particularly the difference between a dissertation and say other grades and modules, you'll find the dissertation's higher, which it ought to be. But again, it's a really important driver of student achievement, and even more importantly is the implication for particular groups of students if you look at their performance. So women do much better than men. We found that no significant effect for Black students. Asian students significantly underperformed compared to white students. So again, there are big equity issues here. Disabled students underperformed as well. And most interestingly, if you look at prior attainment, students who were less academically successful did actually better in their dissertations, or had a higher gap between their dissertation grade and their other average than students who were high performers. So this is an absolutely fantastic piece of assessment that narrows the attainment gap for lower performing students. Now, the question coming out of this research was then, okay, what do we do about it? And so we're trying to find ways of looking at the problems that students face and looking at some sort of systematic approach to looking at what stops them from performing well, what stops them from making the dissertation or the research project even better. Sorry, I left out the disciplines, of course. The sciences did very well on this. They massively overshot the other disciplines. Humanities did fairly well. They again were higher than the social sciences, who looked like the laggards in this group. Right. So the question then becomes, what do we do about it? What sorts of problems are students finding that's preventing them from succeeding in this? And there are two different approaches to this. We looked at staff views, and we had to get creative. And so what we did was we went and looked at a sample of dissertations out of 2 programs and looked at all the feedback comments and did a thematic analysis of those to try to find out what staff thought were the major problems. This is entirely social science. That was seen as the problem area. So that's what we sampled because we didn't have any researchers. And again, we're hoping to expand this in the future, but this is the pilot results. And then the student views, and we got these from module evaluations across disciplines. Again, these were just the summaries from module reports each year. So again, I'm not looking at actual student feedback on the modules. I'm just looking at the module tutors summary of those. So again, this is filtered through staff views. But more importantly, the NSS provides us with narrative comments, and that gave us a nice way of looking across all disciplines and not filtered through staff, to give us a sense of what students. Again, it's a select group of students who actually write comments on the NSS, but it does give us an unfiltered view of their evaluations of what they thought of the dissertation and what problems they encountered. Okay, for staff views, this was fairly straightforward. Again, there was a lot of idiosyncratic discussion of a student work. It would tie into what a particular topic they were doing, but there were certain themes that came across from staff feedback. The first was not formulating a reasonable research question. It was hazy. It was not particularly ambitious. It was descriptive. But again, students struggled to formulate reasonable research questions, or ones that they could actually answer, or ones that fit with what the discipline considers to be a proper topic. So that seemed to come up again and again and again, which is interesting. Secondly, there was a failure to create a clear and inconsistent research design to answer that question, which is, again, that can encapsulate a lot of things. But in essence, the students didn't think through very carefully what evidence they would need to answer the question and write it up in a way that actually addressed the question. Again, this is social sciences, so the dissertations tended to be extraordinarily descriptive in the cases like this. They simply gave a case history without addressing the question. They didn't link it through to an argument. All of those sorts of things, if you grade essays, you beat your head against the wall about. But again, these were very consistently happening in dissertations as well. And again, these are long-running assessments that get consistent feedback usually across a year. So they shouldn't have been showing the same level of issue, but they do. And then finally, the third one, interestingly, there was a failure to carry out a systematic literature review. Students don't seem to know what a literature review is. They seem to think it's a big list of stuff, and it's not tied to the actual topic they're doing. It tends to just be historical narrative or a lot of stuff from Google. And it doesn't follow a critical review of where the literature is, what the major research questions are, what kinds of evidence is brought to bear, what the field thinks about a particular topic. And so those are really, really interesting things to be finding in dissertations in these subjects. Sorry. Right. If we shift to student views, and again, this is mainly using the NSS data. But it was also using the staff evaluations. The staff evaluations for module reports tended to only note where something badly went wrong. And so they're fairly selective, and there wasn't a whole lot of discussion of this, but it did actually fit with some of the issues from the NSS data. The first of all is supervisor issues. As anyone who supervises dissertations know, if you don't answer email quickly, students notice. And this was a particular issue. And again, it wasn't just petty things. These were students saying they could never get hold of their supervisors, that there was a total lack of communication. The person wasn't interested in the topic. They didn't give them any support. They refused to read their work. Again, these are the students' perspectives on this, and I think the sorts of ways in which they were describing this was quite it would be a real problem. Again, this is not just simply not responding to emails quickly. again, I have, like most people, I will have students sending things the day before it's due and saying, hey, could you read my draft? So again, I don't think this is that. These seem to be quite upset people who were very detailed in the types of things they would write. Second, preparation to carry out the research project. The students don't talk about this very much. It's not something they perceive as something that they were missing, but they would sometimes talk about this. They again said they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know what a research question was. They had no idea how to get started in the dissertation itself. So again, their perspective was different from the staff's. They wouldn't have known when they wrote the NSS responses what their grades were or what the feedback was. So they wouldn't have known that they were giving it a totally improper research question or a literature review that wasn't the literature review. But they did get it. I mean, they did get the sense that they didn't know what they were doing, and they brought that through pretty clearly. And then it's sometimes resources. They were worried about not being able to carry out the project. Again, some of this is COVID coming in. A lot of things happened, and you couldn't do lab work. You couldn't do interviews in the field. You couldn't do a lot of the things that many primary researchers would have done for dissertations and projects. And that was a big issue. But again, I don't think this is generally about COVID. I think this is something that is widespread as well. Third, lack of choice. This was really interesting. Some disciplines or subjects very carefully restrict what students can do. There's a long tradition in history. In history departments, you'd have the special subject and a huge big module, and alongside that you do your dissertation. You would have on that topic. And so if you have that very, very careful structure, it's really good for getting students involved in preparing for the dissertation and making sure that they have support and training. But at the same time, it does restrict what they can write about. And where there were staffing issues, perhaps, or other problems, where that choice was really strongly restricted, students got very, very upset. I mean, some of these comments were, bordering on legally slander, slander, I guess we'd call it. Yeah. The university had already removed all the names, so I didn't get to see any of that. But the students would get very, very upset about being moved off of a topic they thought they were going to do. And that's quite often what happened, particularly in sciences. If something went wrong with labs and suddenly, or a research project wasn't going to run suddenly, where the students were going to be brought in as participants, and suddenly they had nothing they could do, and they were told, go do a library project or go do something else. They got very upset. So again, I think this is more about expectations being changed at the last moment. This isn't a general problem with lack of choice. I don't think that's what got people to fill out a narrative response on the NSS. But it is an issue. If students think they're going to have choice and then they take it away, that's very upsetting to them. And they want to feel that they have a certain amount of ownership of these topics. And that's, again, usually one of the defining definitions of a research project as opposed to an essay. You get to choose your own question. You get to develop your own approach and things like that. All right. Finally, there were some COVID restriction issues that came in. Again, they were quite often listed very specifically. So I wouldn't see these pedagogical issues as being COVID related. I mean, they might have been accentuated, but I think they were general problems we have with research projects and dissertations. Okay, so implications. Yeah, supervision. Well, yeah, surprise, surprise. Good communication is really important. And that applies to everything in teaching, I suspect. Again, setting expectations for how fast you can respond is really important. So students won't complain. Again, I think if you tell students what they can expect, they don't usually get too petty about, you've taken 8 hours to respond to my email. What are you doing? Some programs appear to be extremely good at preparing their students. This was often the case in the sciences. But not just the sciences. There are many programs that will have a second year module, for example, which prepares you in the spring term for doing the dissertation. And there's some that do not very little. And again, it's really unclear when you look at different programs how well they're doing that on the face of it. But just coming in as an outsider, there are quite a few who don't seem to do anything until the dissertation hits. And it doesn't seem to be a problem in the humanities, which is interesting. The humanities don't seem to have any formal preparation, but it seems that the way in which they do their subjects is so inherently close to research in the dissertation that it doesn't seem to be a problem. Their students never complain about that. So I don't see that. I only see that in the sciences and social sciences. Next, paying close attention to what skills students need. Again, if you're going to do preparation, it's kind of important to figure out what preparation they need. That's why I think finding out things like literature reviews, and this is where COVID might have come in this particular sample. The university stripped out assessments as much as it could to try to simplify things to reduce student workload. And the staff have really liked it, and they're keeping most of those changes, by the way. So for example, in one of the program we were looking at dissertations, we were looking at the dissertation feedback on, those programs had a preparation module in which you had to do critical literature reviews. Those were removed as part of the COVID bonfire of the assessments, and they weren't put back. So again, there is an importance in trying to think about what students need to do. There were also issues with other social science programs. It would have preparation. They would do quantitative methods training in the second year, try to prepare students for dissertations, and lo and behold, not a single student did a quantitative dissertation topic. So again, I think thinking about what your students actually need in terms of skills and tools is really important, or at least trying to create some synergy between what you're teaching them to do and what they actually do. And so yeah, that became an issue at points.
Jonathan, you've got 4 minutes left.
I'm almost done. So yes, thank you. Again, trying to give them some sense of the things they're going to need to do and practice it. And the literature review was a key one to that. Again, if they're doing essays, they're not going to be practicing research questions. So again, some sort of training in that might be helpful as well to think about. At least the sciences seem to have an easier time with this. They seem to embed more primary research into quite a bit of the training throughout the program. Again, in small things, not huge big research projects, but again, the students don't seem to struggle with that as much as in the social sciences, where they suddenly do something completely different and don't feel they are at all prepared or know what they're doing. And finally, attention to flexibility in topics. Again, that came out of the choice issue. You know, if you're going to have to limit choice, then make sure the students understand what they can expect, and they know that going in, and you don't change it at the last minute. Again, I'm hoping this is all COVID related, but again, choice is kind of a flexible thing. It's an art, giving them enough to make them happy, but not too much so it drives you crazy in terms of supervision. But there we go. That's it for me. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I was just reaching on my reaction to give you a virtual round of applause. There you go, got there in the end. Thank you very much. So we will, as I say, we'll hold questions until both speakers have done their presentation. So if you have any questions for Jonathan, feel free to put them in the chat or we'll take them at the end. And now we'll move on to Claire Pike, who joins us from Anglia Ruskin University. And she was going to be talking to us about practices both pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, and what should we keep going forward. So over to you, Claire.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. As the chair has said, I would like to talk to you a little today about reflections on the learning experiences we've had both before, during, and emerging from the pandemic, and trying to bring all of that together into a cogent view of the further future and what will potentially behoove us most well for the strategy of the next 5 to 10 years educationally in HE. To start off then, I think it is fair to say for all of us that the COVID-19 pandemic has necessitated an awful lot of rapid redesign and change on a timescale that has not always felt entirely comfortable, but has been very necessary. And drawing upon my own background mind, I'd like to make here a biological analogy, which is the period of time called the Cambrian explosion in the fossil record. Now, this was a period about 500 million years ago that lasted for about 10 million years, whereby external environment changes and pressures made an absolutely weird and wonderful proliferation of different types of species. There were all sorts of animals that occurred on our planet that had not seen before, and many of them were not seen since. They were embedded just in this very short period of history where there was an absolutely huge amount of innovation and differentiation suddenly. So out of that, we might reflect upon our educational approaches and think, well, which of those things were born simply out of necessity at the time, and which of them were perhaps born of an acceleration of evolution that was already underway, things that we already wanted to be doing, but perhaps the pandemic speeded up in some way. So our question from there is, what do we do with this? From this sudden diversity, what should survive and be part of a more permanent paradigm? What should go extinct? And perhaps a midway between those two things, what should we tweak and evolve and adapt to new and ongoing conditions as we go through? So that was a sort of starting question for the project. We needed to consider, of the many different ways one could approach this big question, what approach we were going to use. And we took the view that we have within our universities right now quite a special and unique group in the form of people who are studying level 6 in the present academic year. So this group of level 6 students have a unique place in history in that they have experienced higher education pre-pandemic, in the thick of the pandemic, and in the present year, which is emerging from the pandemic. We therefore decided to focus the project on capturing the reflections and wisdom of this particular rare and time-limited group in the context of Anglia Ruskin University, which is a large mainstream HEI, which has a strong widening participation agenda. So I dare say that will colour the data in some ways. And there are 4 faculties which between them deliver quite a wide breadth of subject disciplines. Now, as I've said, this study is ongoing through the present academic year. In presenting this paper, I very much took advantage of the fact that the organisers said that research studies at any point in their genesis are welcome, from those that are merely conceptual to those that are ongoing to those that are all finished and tidied. And we're very much in the middle of this. So in this academic year, we have, towards the end of the first semester of learning, been surveying our level 6 students and have just ended a survey data analysis period after this data gathering period is closed. In the second semester, we will select willing participants from the questionnaire to form focus groups. And these focus groups will meet twice, once at the beginning of the second semester just after Christmas, and again at the end of the academic year, when we're going to be taking their more final reflections as they go forward into being a graduate, essentially. And we're looking for 3 5-person focus groups that will be purposefully sampled to maximise the diversity across faculties and personal characteristics. But right now, we are just here in early December, where the questionnaire closed at the end of last week with 179 participants. And I would very much like to share with you some initial results from this that are quite hot off the press. To start with, we have some basic descriptive statistics of who our participants were. There is representation from all parts of the university, which looks unbalanced, but is actually in quite good proportion with faculty size, where the health and science faculties are considerably larger than the arts, humanities and business and law faculties. So that is a reasonably representative balance. We had a majority of full-time students answering, with some part-time students who we perhaps can delineate later. And as many providers did, during parts of the pandemic where it was legal to provide education in person, we gave our students a choice as to whether they wanted to learn on campus supported by online educational technologies in, I suppose, a blended way, or whether they wanted to learn in an online only mode for personal or logistical reasons. And we have both of those groups represented in the survey data at about a 60-40 split. The first set of questions we asked them were straightforward data gathering around which learning activities they have experienced. To start with, pre-pandemic. And as you would expect, the most popular categories here are on campus, lectures, small group seminars, debates, practical classes, and group work. And encouragingly, I think, a fair number of participants cited informal learning on campus with friends. The picture, as one would expect moving through the pandemic, very much more switched to online activities, where the learning activities most experienced were pre-recording and live online sessions, together with other online supportive learning activities such as online quizzes and discussion boards. So this is, I think, descriptive data that is resonant with what we'd expect before and during the pandemic. In terms of the present academic year, so these people's reflection at the semester that they have just had, pretty much, we're seeing far more of a blend of the two, whereby students are definitely reporting a greater amount of interaction on campus, but interestingly, not so much large group lectures. The on-campus interaction has been more along the lines of practical and small group seminars. Social distancing, if HEIs are still using that, may well be part of that, certainly, with a significant amount of online activity. So we're obviously here in an emergent phase. The meat of the questionnaire really was to ask the students on their opinions of these different methods. And we asked them to rate the different learning activities and methods and scenarios under 3 criteria, which were: how effective is this for your learning? How effective is this at building positive learning communities? And then an overall satisfaction measure, which is pretty important when we consider how this goes into the NSS, as Jonathan was citing just a moment ago. The first lot then, effectiveness for your learning. We asked people to rate these types of learning that they've experienced on a Likert scale. And the ones which were rated most highly were very much the face-to-face activities, practicals, small group seminars, placements, and informal learning with friends on campus. These were the methods that were considered most effective for the students' learning. So that the on-campus interactive active learning methods. And I think it was certainly food for thought that many of the online tools and techniques were rated by the students quite poorly in terms of the effectiveness of their learning, including discussion boards, online sessions, and sessions which were peer assisted but online. The students also didn't rate so highly the effectiveness of hybrid sessions, whereby it was live and there were some students in the room, some students on the internet, on camera in some way. That didn't go over so well, interestingly. Moving on to the next set of criteria around building positive learning communities, we were seeing a reasonably similar picture with these face-to-face methods coming out very highly rated, and many of the online methods not seeming to cut the mustard for this particular group of participants. And I think that is a salutary lesson, in some ways quite a sad one, given how much effort as a sector we have put into trying to build online learning communities over the past 18 months or so. But in the views of these participants, nothing beats the live experience for that community activity. And feeding into that almost precisely was overall satisfaction, whereby, at least from these early data, we seem to see a really excellent synergy between what builds positive learning communities and what contributes to overall satisfaction, which is basically the same things in green and the same things in red. So for our NSS forward-lookingness, I do wonder whether there is a really key link there between learning community and the satisfaction of the course overall. One finding which piqued my interest a little bit is that as higher education researchers, we've been saying almost as a mantra for, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, yeah, the large group lecture is dead. We've moved on from that. There are so many other things that we do and are better. Or is it in that the large group lecture scored pretty respectably across all of these criteria, in contrast to perhaps the other options for more of a content delivery system, such as online recorded lectures, which were rather less popular, and these hybrid sessions, which also were rather less popular, particularly for overall satisfaction. So I just wanted to throw that in there, that as educators and researchers, we perhaps have accepted that there are other ways of doing this than a very traditional lecture, but our students are not necessarily in full agreement at the moment. In addition to asking the students to give us some sort of quantitative feedback on these learning measures, we asked them some open-ended questions. Are there any features of your learning experience from before the pandemic that you miss and you think that we should bring back? There were kind of just under half who said yes. And of those 83 optional free text responses received, 39 of them were variations on bring back large group lectures, which I found pretty interesting. And many of them cited the social aspect. So it's not so much the sage on the stage at the front, it's sitting with your friends, sharing notes, arriving and leaving together, again, very much part of the learning community. Within this, we also had some interesting varied responses of other things we should bring back. Group work on campus, the idea of bouncing ideas off each other, that was quite popular. The idea of lab practicals that were not necessarily assessed. So the idea that students could grow their skills and competencies rather than perhaps the COVID model, which was absolutely stripped down and, okay, we'll put you in the lab when you absolutely have to do something. There was clearly a wish to become more familiar and present in the lab. Field trips, pretty naturally. Some further comments around learning communities, the large groups giving a university experience, and some thoughtful comments here picking out peer-assisted learning, which this participant found quite motivational. So again, the message that was coming through from this was very much about that real life learning community. We also asked the flip question. What features of learning from the pandemic would you suggest that we keep, even when the pandemic is over? And about 2/3 of respondents had something to say about this. We received 123 free text responses, of which about half were variations on the theme of recorded lectures. So is that contradictory to what we were just discussing? I think not really. Because students here were fairly evenly split between wanting the recordings as a backup, as a revision aid, after having been to the live session first. And others were citing pre-recorded lecture segments as quite a nice way to participate in flipped learning. So this wasn't so much, oh, don't want to go to the lecture, just record it for me. It was more, well, let's have a taster up front and then we can discuss it. So there was certainly some popularity there.
You've got 4 minutes left.
Okay. We also had a range of interesting other responses. particularly noting people with certain challenges did appreciate the option to be fully online. And I think that particularly came out with people with mental health struggles or complex lives. There were some good practical suggestions around it's good to be able to make a virtual appointment with a lecturer via a video call. Some interest in the online assessment types that people had experienced and they thought were quite good. They liked social distancing sometimes because it meant they got more attention in small group classes. Tricky one for us to staff. And they liked audience response mechanisms, so chat functions, voting systems. Perhaps this respondent had not experienced something like Whole Everywhere in a large lecture theatre. So he or she was thinking that it would be good to maintain those technologies available in space. So I've told you very, very much that this is an initial analysis. What do we want to do next? The next steps to work with this data further would be a subgroup and intersection analysis, whereby we can break down respondents' views by a range of different characteristics, such as gender, age, ethnicity, presence or absence of a disability or a learning disability, and caring responsibilities, either for older people or for younger people. We will break this down by discipline and subject group, because I think there might be some differences coming out between our faculties and subject areas of study, between full-time and part-time status, and between the choice they made during the pandemic. So I'm very much thinking that the results from our quantitative analysis needs to not be one size fits all, but we'd like to make some different recommendations depending upon this delineation and subgroup analysis. We will also do some more detailed textual analysis of the qualitative questionnaire data and use these things together to form the skeletons of the semi-structured focus group interview outlines. So finally, what are the conclusions we take so far? We can see that the on-campus interactive activities were generally rated most highly. And interestingly, there was a muted response to all of the effort we put in on the online learning, despite 40% of the participants actually having chosen this mode. But perhaps that was through life circumstance as opposed to pedagogical preference. I think I would say that the building positive learning communities is a really strong indicator for overall satisfaction, perhaps a lesson for us to take forward into the NSS, certainly. There was maybe a surprising question mark positivity for the traditional large group lecture among real students, and perhaps an overwhelming sense that students are actually now looking for something which is offering a greater level of flexibility and personalization. There's a lot of diversity within this data set. So maybe when we're thinking about what happens next, what the next set of evolution is, it should be more of an and, not an or. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Claire, and to both speakers. So when I was invited to chair this session, I was